Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today we have a special show on political strategy, the media landscape, and everything that will be important to the 2024 election. And our guest is a national political analyst and strategist and author, Rachel Bitecofer. She most recently wrote Hit 'em Where It Hurts, How to Save Democracy by Beating Republicans at Their Own Game. We recommend going out, buying the book, and reading it. You can find a link to the book in our show notes below this episode. So Rachel, before we start, I just want to thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I'm always excited to talk about how we can hit Republicans where it hurts. So
Your book is chock full of analysis of the messaging landscape and recommendations for how Democrats should campaign more effectively, differently, so to speak. Can you tell us what you see as the biggest flaws in Democratic campaign messaging now? And we know that's a huge question because your book covers a ton of different topics, whether it be the media landscape, whether it be think tanks and nonprofits. But from just a pure messaging standpoint, where do you think the party may not be living up to the lofty heights that it could be?
yeah, no, I'm glad you're asking that straight off. I mean, the reason I devote the first half of the book to bringing everyone into my old political behavior class. I used to teach college, so I taught political behavior in campaigns and elections, and I would teach people about the realities of civic culture, voting participation, and the American voter, which is frankly a little harsh. So when you ask me, what's the most important thing? It's this. And this is what motivated me to go in and quit academia and research and go into political strategy. It's that our system, the flaw of the Democratic entire orbit, whether it's in the party, outside groups, IEs, doesn't matter, is that it is based on a very flawed assumption of the American electorate. And that is that voters are too smart for it, okay? Because voters are very smart. They might even be able to design rockets that go out into space and land back on a launch pad, but that doesn't transfer to civic IQ. And most people are not interested at all in politics. So they don't read the news. They don't know anything about what Donald Trump has done. They know he seized the Capitol. That's it. They don't know any of the details of the coup plot. They can't name which party controls the House of Representatives. Okay. If you hit them with John Roberts, they're going to be like, I don't know, isn't he a movie star? Okay. That's the reality of the rough clay of the electorate. And the Republican Party has always understood that. They understood that, your campaign messaging should be emotive. It should be at the fifth grade level. It should be simplistic. It should name a single villain, and that villain is always Democrats. And it should, if you take it for a fact that almost all the people you're trying to communicate with don't know anything that you know, then the strategy shifts a lot, right? So like if you think everyone's smart like us and you're designing messages for liberals by liberals, right? Then you're going to be trying to persuade people like, oh, this policy's, he likes this policy. He likes that. He's going to do this. He's going to do that or whatever, right? Where the Republicans are understanding, no, if they don't know any of that. So you just tell them a big branding frame like Democrats are socialist, Democrats want to defund the police, Democrats are letting an invasion at the border, whatever it is, that it's low-hanging fruit. It's not up in the branches of complex American politics, okay? It's down low because the electorate barely knows who the vice president is. And so the front half of the book is about getting people on the left, especially because my audience on the left side, this is one of the things that people push back at so hard. Like, they're, no, it can't be true. And I'm like, listen, the Amber Heard Johnny Depp story was more attractive on Google than the reversal of Roe with Dobbs, okay? Like, that's the clay we're working with. And if we don't build our strategy based on that reality, then we're dead right before we even start.
Rachel, I totally hear you about the kind of voter apathy, antipathy to politics. I know that during the Obama years, this is something that I felt like I experienced very much. It felt like no one could talk about politics. It was impolite to talk about politics. It was almost shameful or embarrassing to care about politics. People just wanted to get along with their daily lives and participate in culture and the social atmosphere without having to be bothered by political discussion. But I feel like it did change a little bit during the Trump years, didn't it? I mean, it felt as though we went from a situation where no one cared about politics and no one wanted to talk about politics to a scenario where people were talking about politics all the time, and politics started intruding on people's daily lives in a way that was never really seen, at least since, the Second World War. And I wonder if that has created a new challenge that's not necessarily easier, but different, where instead of a situation where people know nothing about politics, we're in a situation where people are hearing about politics all the time, but might have some misperceptions and misconceptions about what's actually going on.
I would say that I hang out with a lot of normal people. I don't know if it's because of my unconventional life story. I didn't go to college till I was 24. I was a single mom. I started at a community college, right? I traveled around the whole country doing Grateful Dead shows in my teens. So I've been all around, and I've dumpster diving. I've lived from the poorest places to to McMansions basically in that time period. So I've seen a wide swath of America. And the one thing that was always a commonality in all of those experiences was that I was the only person that gave a shit about what was happening in DC. Okay. Nobody else it's not even on their radar. And so, yes, there's been a bit of a civic renaissance because of Donald Trump, right? The pink resistance stuff and blowback. And then Dobbs has added to that a little bit because now you're seeing headlines of women suffering under Republican abortion policies, right? But we're talking about marginal change, friends. We're not talking about, in 2020. I mean, imagine we were all trapped in our houses. We all thought we were going to die. We got the best turnout we've ever gotten in a presidential election. It was historic turnout, and it was still missing 40% of the people who could vote in it. Okay. So that's half the population that still Biden, Trump, pandemic still wasn't paying attention at all. Seeing no political news, not following the news, not going to vote. And that's really, not changed, I would argue.
I suppose that if politics have traditionally been competing with things like the entertainment industry for attention, maybe Trump represents the fusion of entertainment and politics in a way that's helped enable this kind of creep of politics into people's ordinary social lives. He was an entertainment industry figure. That's really what he was known for. He had a television show. He played a character on TV that a lot of people seem to think was a real person and voted for a fictional character to become president.
Well, there you go. And it's still like that. I mean, I just watched interviews on TV and tweeted about this 5 minutes ago. The myth, in the book, I talk about my conversations. I have conversations with normal people, because we're not normal. If you're listening to this show, if you're hosting it, if you read the newspaper, you're not normal, okay? Normal people don't do any of that. And so I always focus group every normal person I come across. And I talk about a story with a cabbie in DC. And I asked, he's a immigrant, a minority. And I was like, what do you think of Donald Trump? And he's like, good businessman. I mean, that brand, all the news and stories we've seen about Trump's businesses, this Trump case in New York, not normal people who watch The Bachelor don't know any of that. Okay. So at the end of the day, the electorate only knows what we pay in earned media to tell them through political messaging, or paid media, I meant to say.
Who are we? What do we stand for? What do we believe? What will we do to maintain our democracy? Will we not hide from history, but make history? Will we put partisanship aside and put country first? I say we must.
Democracy is a choice. It's a choice we make to choose union over disunion, progress over chaos, validity, truth over lies. A choice to remember history, not erase it, no matter how hard it is that people try to sometimes erase it.
Equality and democracy are the rock upon which this nation is built. They're how we became the greatest nation on earth. They're why, for more than 2 centuries, America has been a beacon to the world. Patriotism, liberty, justice for all, hope, possibilities. We are still, at our core, a democracy. For a long time, we've told ourselves that American democracy is guaranteed, but it's not. We have to defend it, protect it, stand up for it, each and every one of us. I'm asking our nation to come together unite behind the single purpose of defending our democracy regardless of your ideology.
The Biden campaign is focusing on a message of democracy being at risk, right? That's there was a speech in Philadelphia that the conservatives maligned because the background was red or something like that a couple of years ago, and it outlined the roadmap that I assume the campaign will follow through this election, at least partially. So I agree with you. Most normal voters, like my mom, she's working like 2 jobs, waiting tables. She's pro-Trump, but it's not getting into the Inflation Reduction Act or the bipartisan infrastructure bill, right? It's not the nuances of the policy. She sees a quote unquote strong man. He's loud. He's brash. She's able to kind of transplant her image of herself onto him, and she likes what she's seeing. Okay, we get that. But if 40% of voters who just didn't come out, didn't care, and a lot of voters who came out maybe don't understand the issues intricately, is it smart to have a foundational message about the importance of democracy when we just established maybe most of the voters do not care about democracy?
Well, they don't care because, we are cultured into that. And I talk about that in the book about, what John was pointing out. There's a pride, in fact, of sitting out of politics. So I run into people all the time, and I try not to tell people what I do, but it usually comes up in some capacity. As soon as I say politics, I don't do any of that. And the thing is they're not embarrassed. It's not like they skip their Peloton workout that day. Okay. They are telling you, no, I don't do that, because they're proud, because they think they're morally superior, because they don't participate in politics because it's dirty and gross. And that's what we're doing in this country from children's age all the way up, is we're socializing people not to understand that democracies are maintenance organizations. They don't just run on their own. You have to, be informed to be able to be engaged and what have you. So it's a real problem because, getting people to understand, how that implicates, people like your mother, right? She's not going to read the Mueller report. She's not going to read news reports other than what Hannity says on Fox News about the Mueller report. Right? Like she is only going to hear like what branding or marketing firms would call top of mind awareness, right? And that's why Republicans, despite 20 years now of this collapse, and you lived through it, some of the early parts of this collapse, haven't really been producing in their 2 main areas, economics and national security, for a while now. But if you still poll people and you ask them which party is good on the economy, they're going to say Republicans, and the same with national security. So like fixing top level branding stuff is really, really difficult. Now onto the Biden campaign, I think it's very important that they have a big macro existential threat crisis, because if you have a bunch of people who don't even know there's a democratic crisis, people on the right are far more likely to believe that there was a democratic crisis because their leaders have told them that the guy sitting in the White House is a thief, right? He stole the seat. He's not a legitimate president. Those people believe that. That's why they stormed the Capitol. If you accept that earth to reality that MAGA's living in, it is a very despotic democratic party that they're up against. It's an existential threat, right? So it's really important if we accept, and we must accept, that most people have no idea what Trump is saying, what he's promising to bring, what Project 2025 means for their individual civil liberties, their careers, like all the federal civil service employees. Then our job is to make sure that is top of mind awareness, the theme of the campaign, not, did gas prices go down? I want and believe that we should mention those things, but the frame has to be big. It has to be big, and it has to fall. You can tie in all of these other things, whatever your issue might be, under this existential threat of losing democracy. So it's a good topic and approach for me. And what really helps guys with us doing that, and I say this in the book, is that, we could have made these strategic shifts, but what helped was the Supreme Court stealing my rights. Okay. Like now when I tell people, hey, you're going to steal your rights, they believe me because they've done it, and they promised over and over and over and over again that they wouldn't. So it's been very helpful to have a concrete example of what it means to lose a freedom or a right. And I think that's why you're going to see so much content in this cycle on Roe repeal and reproductive freedom.
I think the scariest thing for a lot of us is to realize that maybe many Americans don't have the same kind of emotional connection to democracy that we always assumed that they did. Growing up in the United States in a public school education, the civics classes emphasized how important democracy was all the time. And I know the difference between democracy and authoritarianism because I lived in an authoritarian country for my whole career until the pandemic. And I can see very clearly the different experiences that you have living in an authoritarian country and living in a democracy. Living in a place where you can't criticize the sheikh, you can't say anything bad about him, or you could end up locked up. That's so different here. I mean, I remember even visiting other democracies like in Africa. I would get out of the airport and the first thing the cab driver would say is, the politicians are ruining this country. And I'd say, oh my God, I feel like I'm back home in America because isn't it amazing you can say something like that about the president? I think it's kind of frightening to realize that so many Americans might not have that same kind of emotional connection to democracy, and that saying democracy isn't enough.
And it comes to like us making sure that they understand, right?
Yeah.
So like, it's one thing like when people say Biden's going to run on democracy, I don't know what they think in their head that he's just going to go out there and say, we need democracy. No, it's about explaining to people how they have, how our system provides them individual liberties and securities that allow them to live the kind of lives they choose to live, right? So it's very tangible. And I do think, even within the 60% that does vote, right? Because this other 40%, they have no idea we're on the cusp of a total cataclysm. But within that 60, let's say there is some, salience and some knowledge of that, getting them to appreciate like how thin of a protection a system of laws, whether it's institutionalized after 248 years, or it's only a couple years old in Germany under the Weimar Republic, at the end of the day, what protects us is the allegiance to follow those norms. And as soon as somebody is willing to suspend the Constitution, to say that there's a border emergency and declare martial law and take your civil liberties, that's all it takes, guys. It takes the person willing to do it and a party willing to help them do it. And we have no reason to assume that this Republican Party, especially since it's producing documents like Project 2025, is interested in trying to, stop that.
And even if the United States doesn't go the way of the Weimar Republic and turn into a fascist Reich, like what happened in Germany, it's really easy to imagine how the US or a comparable country can just slide into a kind of kleptocratic hybrid state, like what we see in a place like Turkey or in Hungary or increasingly India. I mean, this is a path that so many countries have followed, and the ingredients are all there. I mean, we just had a president in the last term who's running again, who personalized the office and turned it into the subject of all kinds of bribery and patronage. He combined his business interests with the office in a way that we hadn't seen before, but we realized someone can just do, and we don't have an easy way to stop them from doing it. We're only a couple steps away from a system like that. It doesn't necessarily look like Nazi Germany, but it means a government that's not working in the interest of the American people and is serving themselves instead.
Yeah. And I keep trying to tell people, don't compare us to Hitler in 1942. Okay. This is a dictator. He had been in power almost a decade. By that time, all of the democratic, institutions have been successfully overtaken and eroded. What we should be looking at is 1930 Germany and the parallels there, especially how the Nazi Party used coalitional support with conservatives, sound familiar, to get into the position of power. And then as soon as it was there, it was made these changes. And I'm going to be documenting those changes on my Twitter at Rachel Bitecofer all year. It's called Project 1933, and it's linking that history. It's gonna bring to life the actual real time process of how within 10 months of assuming office, these democratic protections get eroded easily. And I'm going to be showing how it happens specifically there, so that we can talking about how our system can also have that happen.
So, Rachel, we're talking about messaging very broadly, which, of course, we have to do. We have, a limited amount of time here, and this country is very large, 350 million. So, obviously, there's some segmentation. So, I'd want to just drill down a little bit, because you go over negative partisanship In your book, you also go over independent voters, folks that characterize themselves as independent voters. And you use a stat that I learned in political psychology at Tufts University that 80% of those folks are actually probably decided with one party or another. And also that it's probably going to mirror their parents' political persuasions. Taking all of that into consideration, that there's probably 6 or 7 swing states that matter, there's maybe those states will come down to a combined, 60 to 120,000 votes. There are persuadable voters out there. I think the number was around 10 to 15% that I saw in your book of the independents that are potentially persuadable. So when we're talking about messaging like for democracy or really anything in this election, how much are we focusing on stoking negative partisanship in the Democratic base versus trying to persuade voters that are still able to be reached?
So glad that you asked that, because probably the most important contribution the book makes is it explains how negative partisanship strategy works, right? And it's adapted from the Republican system, which they started to evolve in 2004 with Karl Rove's really smart ballot initiative process in swing states, okay? And so when you say, well, Rachel, what do you do in a swing state like Wisconsin? Because do you do negative partisanship with the base and then try to persuade? No, dude, you don't. You do one message that both motivates the base, red meat, right? It's, Trump is coming for your freedom. And that message is designed to push independent voters away, right? Republicans don't win independents by persuading them. They don't tell them in commercials, I have this great bio. I used to be a cop. I rode a motorcycle around. I used to be an Air Force pilot. I'm going to work across the aisle and be bipartisan. And we know this in analytics. In the book, I show you the analytics of the asymmetry in approach. So what my strategy is designed to do is to end that. It ends the entire concept that you have one segment of the electorate that you're going to try to micro target based on not just women, but Black women, Latino women. We don't even talk to most Latino voters. So we should not be going down into sub-levels like that. We should be making sure we blanket Latinos with one message. The Republican Party wants to turn America into a dictatorship, steal all your shit, right? So, getting people to stop bifurcating the strategy in that way is probably the biggest mission. And we know that where we diverted the strategy, Arizona, Michigan last cycle in 2022, we had historic wins, okay? Where we ran the old strategy, which is what you describe, a message that maybe you have some resources to spend on base turnout, and then you have a persuasion message, and it's all about, I'm a farmer, I have a farm, whatever, right? That did not work. It didn't work in North Carolina, it didn't work in Ohio, and it didn't work in Florida. All good candidates, bad strategy, right? So my book is designed to fix that across the swing map. We got some of the swing races going the right way in 22, and it helped thwart that big red wave that they were expecting. But at the end of the day, we have to save democracy this fall, and we have to save all 3 branches. The Senate is going to be an incredibly heavy lift for Democrats to maintain control. And the way that we do that is we stop with this bifurcated strategy. We have one message. It is designed to move voters to the polls. And for us, right? Independents they're not buying what you're selling. Just make sure that they don't vote for Republicans. That's what you do. That's what they've been doing to us for years. And it's worked. I mean, why is Ron DeSantis getting 60% in Florida when he's not a moderate, right? I mean, we look at all these candidates like J.D. Vance. Why doesn't J.D. Vance have to be moderate to win office? He doesn't, right? Because their message isn't about selling a product nobody likes, nobody wants to buy. We're not Toyota trucks. We're politics. Nobody likes this product. Okay. So it's much harder to market a product like on appeal. And it's much easier as Republicans learn and pioneered to force, if you've got 2 choices, to make sure people won't buy this one.
Even before Jane Fonda went to Hanoi to meet with the enemy and mock America, John Kerry secretly met with enemy leaders in Paris, though we were still at war and Americans were being held in North Vietnamese prison camps. Then he returned and accused American troops of committing war crimes on a daily basis. Eventually, Jane Fonda apologized for her activities, but John Kerry refuses to. In a time of war, can America trust a man who betrayed his country?
So, Rachel, when we talk about learning from the 2004 campaign and Karl Rove, we're talking about those successful ballot strategies, but we're also talking about the year of the Swift boat ads. We're talking about the year when the Republicans employed some real political dark arts to paint their opponent in a negative light in a way that I think many people believe really crossed the line. They were attacking Senator John Kerry on the basis of his war record, on the fact that he served the United States at war in Vietnam. And they were saying that he had, his whole career in Vietnam was a sham. He was only doing it to win medals. He faked his injuries. These very ugly attacks on a man who was a decorated veteran. We've seen some other pretty ugly.
Yeah, but who won the election in 2004, John?
Exactly. And another example that I wanted to mention was 1992, George W. Bush's father, George Bush, ran the infamous Willie Horton ad that was attacking Governor Mike Dukakis for furloughing a prisoner, Willie Horton, who went out of prison and committed a rape during his furlough. And they said, Dukakis, let him out. He's letting all the prisoners out. They're going to attack your wives and daughters. And again, many people look back at this ad and say it was a shameful moment in American political history. It was a very racially charged ad featuring this scary Black American running against the first non-Northern European ever to run for president. It was a very ugly moment. And, when we talk about learning the political dark arts, I wonder if we think there's a line. Is there something that we shouldn't cross? I'm thinking of the 2012 campaign.
No, we are facing, guys, look, they tried to overthrow the government, okay? Like, we only got lucky that it didn't happen. We are in a moment where there is no line. I mean, we don't have to become them. That's the nice thing. They have to make shit up about us. They are so egregiously bad that all we have to do is make sure America sees them as they are and not as how they imagine them to be, good on the economy, good at national security. We need to make them look at the ugly, ugly face of the modern Republican Party and appreciate that. And I'm so glad you did those two anecdotes because they are exactly what I'm talking about with Republican messaging. They won both of those races. They won. Okay. And they won swing voters, and that's not persuasion like we think of it. That is persuasion like I think of it, though, right? That's Republican persuasion. Don't vote for John Kerry. He's a fake war hero. It's not about George Bush selling George Bush, right? It's about getting swing voters who have two choices not to vote for the other choice. And so they're both perfect examples, of how Republicans got rid of the two buckets and morphed into one electoral strategy, but also, how long and slow and behind we are in this game of hyperbolic messaging. Like, we have to tell people Republicans are going to steal your Social Security. Republicans protect the rights of killers over your kids when it comes to guns, right? That's the kind of stuff that we need to be doing. And, I'm absolutely unabashedly willing to do so.
So, Rachel, with Trump, the Democrats don't need to make up anything like the Republicans did with Kerry. You can say this man has been found by court to have committed sexual assault. He was a Jeffrey Epstein associate. He has been said to have been broken into women's, children's dressing rooms. The list of things that he's done is almost impossible to comprehend. There's so much material that is factually proven, and it's so ugly. You don't need to tell any lies. So you don't really need to worry about crossing that kind of line like they do with the Swift boats.
Yeah. And I tell people that in the book. I'm like, listen, I'm not telling you that you got to become a Republican and do terribly horrible things like that, but you do need to hit them with emotive, hyperbolic, simplistic language. Yeah.
Yeah. So with Trump, you don't need to worry about making anything up because you don't need to make anything up. But some of the other candidates, even we've seen Democrats kind of maybe cross that line. I'm thinking of in 2012 when Harry Reid was holding up a stack of papers and said, I have proof here in my hand that Mitt Romney is a criminal tax cheat. I can prove that Mitt Romney has criminally cheated on his taxes. And it was completely made up. And Reid was asked about this after the election. They said, it turned out that your evidence was completely falsified. You had invented this claim. You're accusing the opponent of criminal activity on no basis. How do you feel about that? And Harry Reid smiled and said to the interviewer, well, he lost, didn't he? I mean, do we think that, obviously you don't do it about this with Trump, but is that inappropriate?
Yeah, no, I don't think you need to do that. I mean, we don't need to make shit up, because if maybe you don't understand or refuse to accept how civically fucking stupid your voting audience is, okay? They don't even know which party controls the House, like, let alone who Mike Johnson is. So, if you accept the fact that, like, the audience doesn't have a base of knowledge, then, within the Republican coalition, there's not a politician they couldn't put up that I couldn't hammer them on completely factual, real-time, life, threatening kind of stuff. So, yeah, but I don't think you need to I would never make up something like that personally.
So I want to switch gears just a little bit and get into your views on the current media ecosystem that we're all living in, which, impacts in a large way political messaging. I think it's pretty accepted we're living in an age of information silos where folks get information from disparate sources and gravitate towards ideological messaging that aligns with their worldview. So if you're conservative, or rather a Republican to be more accurate, you're probably going to watch Fox News and listen to Ben Shapiro, for example. And on the right, the way that this has manifested itself is it's spawned from my perspective, almost its own media ecosystem. And there hasn't been that creation on the left. So we are witnessing this asymmetry. You have OAN, you have Newsmax, even Fox News. But on the left, there's the Young Turks, which I think we would all laugh at. That's not really a real organization. So why do you think there has been this asymmetry that is developed in political media that has obviously influenced the capabilities and tactics used to message?
I lay out this asymmetry pretty clearly in the book. One thing I don't talk about, though, is why it's so much easier, because, you're trying to make something readable. And political science has a lot, right? So political science has a lot of data on, Justin, what you're talking about. And here's the thing that it tells us. On the left, you're right. Like, there is an information silo, but on the left side of it is a very diverse ecosystem. Okay. It could be anything from NPR to NBC to MSNBC to CNN, whatever. Like, when you look at survey data, that's what people say they're watching. And on the right, it's Fox. It's always and forever, and maybe now, maybe some OAN, but it's always been Fox. And when you look at that data from Pew with media choices, you'll see very clearly they don't trust any other media. They didn't before Donald Trump, and they definitely don't now, because Donald Trump did the whole enemy of the people thing, right? So we really do have a situation where we have Earth 1 and Earth 2, and Earth 2 is now an impenetrable fortress. Like, your average Republican voter who says that Trump is innocent, they don't know any of the indictments. They never read any of them. They don't want to read them because they don't want to have to know. And all the media they consume is ignoring it, or, calling it a witch hunt or whatever. And so long as they don't look, they don't know. That is something that we would have a real hard time building for a few reasons, but mostly because the two parties' coalitions are very different. Now, Democrats are like interest groups, right? So there's, women's rights and climate change and, criminal justice, all these different causes under this one tent party, right? And on the Republican, and it's multiracial, multi-religious, multi-everything. Over on the other side, you have you used to anyway, have an ideological coalition, and it was homogenous, mostly white people who are conservative, right? It's much easier to create that kind of ecosystem. And at the end of the day, they tried to build some liberal ecosystems, Air America in the early 2000s, so on. And you got Midas Touch Network now. And you guys have a show, right? Here's the thing that's difficult about it is that we liberal people apparently have better things to do than just absorb talk shows all day. Okay. Like, our habits are very different. It's kind of like getting out of the SEC in football. In the Pac-12, we love football, but we have other shit to do, right? Like, there's other awesome things to go do. In Alabama, it's football, and football, right? There's nothing else but football and church. That's all they're focused on.
The Florida man accused of mailing bombs to prominent Democrats and media figures pleaded guilty on Thursday. 57-year-old Cesar Sayoc was charged with sending bombs to people, including former President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and actor Robert De Niro. Sayoc was found living in his van outside a Florida auto parts store. The van was covered in violent, anti-democratic, and pro-Trump stickers. Sayoc pled guilty to 65 criminal counts, including one for the use of a weapon of mass destruction, which carries a maximum sentence of life in prison. In court, Mr. Sayoc said he is, quote, extremely sorry, and added he never intended for the bombs to explode.
How much of the right wing gravitating towards these shows that you said there isn't the same appetite for on the left has to do with an ends justifies the mean approach to political messaging, which is in large part responsible for the current political disaster we are facing. So to put that for the listeners in more easier terms, the right wing messaging plays on hatred and fear of your opponent, generally speaking, to the point where they are activating potential mass shooters, potential mass bombers. I remember a guy who had
some guy just beheaded his father because he worked in the federal government, dude.
That's a perfect example. There was a guy who YouTube live streamed the beheading of his father while he was spewing far right wing talking points. There was, I remember during the Trump years, there was a guy who had this decal on his van. It was like a Trump van who threatened to bomb CNN. So my question is, how much of it is due to the vitriolic nature of the Republican messaging, drawing these people to their shows because it's playing on their strongest set of emotions, whereas Democrats just inherently aren't trying to paint their opponents as the enemy of humanity, as somebody that is trying to come and kill you. And right. Is it necessarily a bad thing that, this is kind of John's question again, but unless you're willing to go to an extreme level where you're painting your opponent as subhuman, are you able to get people to listen to you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So to me, it's not so much about the opponent, right? And demifying the opponent. It's what the opponent is doing. The opponent is supporting a regime or want to be a regime that's going to pass a national abortion ban, right? It's going to probably round up and deport millions of brown people, right? I mean, they're saying that's what they're going to do on day one, right? So to me, if I would feel differently if I had to make up the threat, but the threat is real. The threat is real. All I would say to people about that is with Republicans, they're making it up, right? They have 10 miles of the border. They have all these news crews. It's 24 hours a day, immigration invasion. Brown people are coming. They're going to rape and kill you. I mean, that's what they have 24 hours a day pounding out. That is not good, right? And that is why we are in this position. So when you ask me what role has that played, I just put out a graph yesterday from my dissertation. I had forgotten all about it. Data that ended in 2012. And you can see literally mass polarization doesn't exist. And then when the internet gets invented, boom, right? It happens. And the reason is that people are intentionally being radicalized by Republican propaganda. Certainly what I'm saying is if you are trying to talk to voters and there's somebody over there shouting, she's a socialist, she likes genital mutilation, and you're trying to tell them, well, I passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill. Good luck, okay? Because you're not going to win that. They're not going to hear you. You either become hyperbolic in return or you die. It's that, and people will die. If I fail to convert the swing map to this strategy and Republicans rule America, they are already telling us they've written a 1,000-page document called Project 2025, where they lay out how they're going to ignore the courts, how they're going to end civil service protections and replace all those people with partisans. They're already hiring for it on the Project 2025 website. So if you're a young conservative and you want to be a fascist Nazi, all you have to do is go apply at Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 databank, because what they're looking for on the day that they get to do it is to pull all the career merit people out and put them in with partisan hacks. So, to me, It's, we wouldn't be in this position, frankly, if we had pivoted by 2010. It's because we waited so long and just hung on stubbornly to this idea of our better angels that we are in an existential crisis now. So,
yeah, all that Schedule F stuff that you're talking about, Rachel, hollowing out this career civil service of professionals, replacing them with partisan hacks. I mean, that very much serves to enable that kleptocratic creep that we were talking about, that slide, not into necessarily Nazi fascism, but into a system of patronage where the people in office are using the instruments of government to take for themselves. But it also really degrades the quality of public service that people will be getting. I mean, do you want the fire department to be run by an incompetent or a competent? Do you want the post office to be run by someone who knows how to organize transportation networks and schedule deliveries? Or do you want it to be run by someone who spends all of their time listening to, Alex Jones? And I think that people need to understand how that's going to impact the quality of services that they are getting, because it's not just about, is Trump and his friends, are they using the government to steal money? I mean, that matters, but the way that it impacts people is that they get worse services from the government. And that's why living in a corrupt country is worse. Yeah. I mean, if you go to corrupt countries, I've been to many of them, you can see that the quality of public services is noticeably worse. And those are the stakes, aren't they?
Yes. And if you want to do anything, you have to bribe officials to do it from bottom all the way up, guys. Like, we don't want to do this. It's so bad. And here's the thing, John. If Project 2025 was in place last in 2020 when Trump lost, we would be already living in an autocracy, because the reason he could not do the thing he wanted to do was the whole DOJ civil service said, we will quit all in en masse, right? And that's the goal of Project 2025, friends, is to get to the position where something like that comes, where you have to ignore the Supreme Court, or you're rounding up people in large mass. You want to make sure that there's no one down there to gum up the works. And that's why it's such a fixture. They've been working on that Schedule F plan now for a couple of years, right? Like I said, they're taking applications for it. So it's something they're doing it in plain sight. And it's always been frustrating to me. I've been forced into this Cassandra role now for 8 years, because it's happening right in front of us. And yet we don't seem able to and now that I've studied World War II so extensively, it's just optimism bias. Like, humans cannot accept that something terrible is going to happen, especially when they're coming from a situation that's stable. And we can see optimism bias. I've seen it in the diaries of Jews who had been dispossessed and rounded into ghettos in Warsaw, who were walking over dead bodies every day to go to work, if you were lucky, right? And who were hearing rumors that being deported east meant being killed. And yet still in their personal diaries, there is hope and optimism and a refusal to kind of accept that could be true, right? And so it tells me that the biggest threat that we face in this cycle, in this moment of American history, is this assumption that it can't happen here because we're somehow special. And as Mitt Romney and I apparently do the same thing every night, we study the maps of civilizations. They come, they rise, they fall, folks. Like, we're not guaranteed to be at this top tier position that we're in. We're living through the best time period of human history too, bar none, especially in these developed Western countries. And yet we're on the verge of pissing it all away. So.
And yeah, we've got a handful of some very pleasant and developed countries. There's so many more corrupt countries in the world than there are developed countries in that sense, that with, totally clean government and transparency and, effective law enforcement and so on. There's so many more corrupt countries, and many of them are not very nice places to live. They're poorer. The quality of service is worse. I mean, the train isn't coming. There's gridlock in traffic every day. Your pension is somehow smaller than it seems like it should be. You have to bribe a police officer or he's going to shake you down and so on. I mean, this is the way most people in the world live. And that's very much what America could look like. We're already starting to see it in some regards. But Rachel, when you were talking just a minute back about the attempts to build a left-wing equivalent of Fox News and why they weren't successful, I mean, you mentioned Air America. I remember Air America. I also remember Current TV. I don't know if anyone listening to this is going to remember Current TV because no one watched it. But I've got an alternative theory that might challenge your thesis a little bit about why it's so difficult to build a left-wing equivalent. And that's because there is this more institutional trust on the left. So the average left-wing American or center-left American, Democratic voting American is perfectly content to get their news from the New York Times, CNN, PBS. They're perfectly content to watch mainstream entertainment products that are put out by Hollywood and the networks and so on. They're perfectly content to watch sports without complaining about Taylor Swift being visible in the audience. There's a trust in American institutions and mainstream life that the Republican activists don't seem to have. And that's what's pushing them to these alternative ecosystems. And that's also in the political space as well. So we've seen how Democrats seem to trust their leaders. They think fondly of Obama. They think fondly of Pelosi and Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries. The Republicans, many of them do not trust their own leaders. They think very poorly of John Boehner. They thought poorly, at least today, certainly of recent nominees like Mitt Romney and the Paul Ryan and the other institutional leaders. And this is part of why Trump was able to do this hostile takeover of the GOP. And what I want to pose to you, Rachel, is does this possibly suggest that the Democrats have been pretty successful at toxifying the GOP brand, that it's even spilled over to GOP voters themselves, that the Democrats won so much at toxifying the GOP on the Iraq War, on corruption in Washington during the mid-2000s with Tom DeLay and all of that stuff, on the economic issues, saying Mitt Romney, plutocrat, that this has actually toxified the GOP so effectively that even GOP voters hate the GOP.
Yeah, no, it really, so, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not right, but let me add another dimension to it. Okay. So if you have this the last thing that I would ever want for the left is this information silo ecosystem, because it radicalized the Republicans built that shit, and it made sense because, like, if you have a conservative worldview, then certain things like liberal culture is very offensive, right? So, like the belief that there wasn't really conservative media out there, like that's not unfounded when they started to finance right-wing media. The problem is that once they built Frankenstein, it got out of control and started to eat them. And Justin, you lived through the Tea Party purging. And that's when my research career began. So I know it very well. That stuff, none of that stuff, the Tea Party revolution, the fact that now 10 years later, it's a 70% extremist base, 30% establishment ratio in the modern Republican Party. That's completely flipped around. It should be 30-70 like it is in the Democrats. None of this stuff would be happening. Not the insurrection, not Donald Trump, none of the crazy shit people, cosplaying Civil War and can't wait, fantasizing about killing their neighbors. None of that shit would be happening if they hadn't invented that ecosystem, because it radicalized people. They became so radical, they ate their own leadership. So that hatred that you see to Ronna McDaniel from Cat Turd or whatever, right? Like that stuff is really a product of right-wing indoctrination, right? It's not, I would love to say that the Democrats did it, but within that Republican radical cult, it is very, 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 whose establishment is people who were Tea Partiers today, right? Yesterday, right? Like Marco Rubio or whoever, right? Though it's eating itself. And we just haven't seen anything like that on the left. We do have an extremism problem. Every party has a base. And that the fringes of that base are crazy as fuck, right? It's like on the left, you've got the people who think Hamas is a resistance fighter and don't seem to understand, the complexities behind the state of Israel and why it's so difficult to maintain a free democracy strip of land surrounded by authoritarian, brutal authoritarian regimes that want to wipe it out, right? So, like, I'm glad that we don't have the ecosystem, because I don't know what kind of party that would create, but we know that's what radicalized Republicans, and now it eats them. It's eating them up. It's eating up even people like Ron DeSantis. So it's poetic justice in some ways, but also so dangerous.
I heard you mention financing, and you do go over ultra wealthy financiers in your book, and I found it fascinating. And you outline, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please correct me. But I think that the Republicans are more effective at getting donations to nonprofits and advocacy groups. I'm going to characterize it as groups that influence the political messaging sphere almost, and that the ultra wealthy Democrat donors aren't necessarily doing the same thing. What I immediately thought is billionaires really like money, whether they're liberal or conservative.
Yes.
They are billionaires because they've probably been pretty damn frugal and have protected their investments, with their lives or the energy that they would their lives. So when Republican big donors are looking at the political ecosystem, yes, they're giving lump sums of money for nothing in return. However, there is a agreement with the Republican Party that if they get elected, they're going to cut regulations, they're going to cut taxes, and this investment is it's a big business investment. So it really isn't strings attached. And I experienced that working for Seaboard Corporation, Fortune 400 agribusiness. The owner and SVP of government affairs brought me into conversations about potentially starting a $2 million PAC for Mitt Romney. And it's like, well, this will be an investment. On the Democratic side, what is it just that the billionaires aren't incentivized because they're not going to get a dollar and cents return on their investments? Because if they put Democrats into office, very likely going to have more climate change related regulations that impact different sectors of the economy. You're probably going to have more tax and spend and things that, generally speaking, maybe more Wall Street regulations that these big billionaires have worked their entire life to oppose. Is it just unequal?
Well, yes, and it's always going to be for the reasons that you just, I think, really well laid out. Okay. At the end of the day, most billionaires are about being billionaires and they want more money and they're going to do and invest. I mean, my God, the return on investment of someone like Sheldon Adelson, what he has, for every $1 he spends on elections, he's multiplying 100 on return, right? And that's true for all these wealthy donors. There's two problems. Number one, I don't think anyone's had an opportunity, and I'm sure hoping it happens to me one day, to explain to these billionaires, like, look, you shouldn't be just writing a check to a super PAC, whatever, right? We need to build the infrastructure, and that's what they're doing. So Turning Point USA is financed at the tune of $80 million. I went and debated Charlie Kirk in Arizona because he invited me down, and mostly, folks, because I wanted to see the infrastructure. 4 multi-level office buildings in some of the most expensive real estate in Arizona. They even have one devoted entirely to what they call logistics. I didn't get in it. Okay. When I was in the studio, people were flying, coming back from college campuses all across the country. What we have is 600 different grassroots groups. None of them are paid. None of them have money. They're not centralizing things. So it's for every 10 billionaires, I would think one of them would be willing to spend money that's not directly going to grow their wealth. Right. But that's all we need. We only need a couple. We just need them spending the money the right way. And so, in their defense, what do they hear from Democratic candidates? I'm not taking corporate money. I'm not da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, dude, I got to tell you, the worst nominee to me is one that swears off money. We need money to win or we're all going to die, right? So the lesson in the book to Democrats is pretty like stark, right? It's very different because we got to get money out of politics. Yeah, fine. Until it's out though, we need it. And we need to be able to resource infrastructure building like the right has done in the courts with their Federalist Society shit and Judicial Watch. In the state legislative stuff. So they have an organization I talk about in the book called ALEC, where they do model legislation. So, when trans stuff comes up, you get 26 states all at once making it illegal to be trans, right? That's the kind of infrastructure we're going to need if we can put out the wildfire, survive 2024, keep Trump and the Republicans from the executive branch, which is bare minimum what we need to survive. This is the work we have to do if we want to return America to even a semblance of a majority rule system, because right now we don't have a tyranny of the majority. We have a tyranny of the minority, right?
No, and I agree with the fact that both sides need to play. And I think we had Senator, I went to his high school, Sheldon Whitehouse on our show, who's the largest opponent to dark money in politics a couple of years ago. And he was advocating for super PACs being used by Democrats and saying, if both sides are going to do this, we need to do it. So it's like, we may not like it.
Yeah, you can't get rid of partisan gerrymandering while the other side is doing it, okay? Because you're going to give them 35 seats in the House just by you unilaterally disarming, right? So yes, exactly.
Dasha, I want to start with you. You've been covering the DeSantis campaign. As we said at the top of the show, he was scheduled to appear this morning. Yep. He didn't, due to what his campaign said was a scheduling conflict. You have a deep dive inside what's happening in the campaign. You call it, or a source calls it, a total failure to launch. What did you learn?
Well, look, over the course of covering this campaign, there are many stories that kind of explain why he failed to really get off the ground in the way that a lot of people expected him to. But one of those stories came to us in the final days of the Iowa caucus, and it has to do with a puzzle. Now, stay with me here. Multiple staffers from the headquarters of the DeSantis Iowa operation, their field operation run by Never Back Down, reached out to me and my producer, Abby Brooks, and said that the CEO and chairman of that organization was spending a significant amount of time in those final critical days working on a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Now, some of those staffers were so confused and found it so absurd that one of them actually took a photo of it and shared it with us. And the frustration was described to me from one of them, saying that, look, staffers are putting their dedication and devotion to electing Governor DeSantis, and they come in and the CEO and chairman of the organization is sitting there working on a puzzle for hours. Now, in a comment to NBC News, Scott Wagner, the gentleman in the picture there, tells us that it was an office puzzle. He said that it was there when they arrived and became a sense of pride for team members, and everyone chipped in a few minutes to get it done and noted his pride of the team. But look, Kristen, the fact that in those critical final days, one of the top people that was trying to get DeSantis elected, trying to get a win for him in Iowa, was spending time working on something unrelated to the caucuses is just emblematic of the sort of mismanagement and wasted efforts that a lot of the sources we talked to for this piece say plagued the team and the DeSantis campaign from the very beginning.
Not ideal.
I hear you about the importance of creating an entire ecosystem, right? Or a comprehensive group, so to speak. And I wanted to get your perspective on what we can learn from Ron DeSantis' failed campaign, and specifically Jeff Rowe, Axiom Strategies. For our listeners, he was once, before this cycle, considered an GOP election guru. I take issue with that because I understand how the group works with intimate familiarity. However, that's the large overriding view in the super PAC world, was that this guy's an ace. So what did the DeSantis group do? They said, we need to create a top-down centralized organization that's going to be able to run everything. They took a new approach to campaigning where they removed a lot of power from Ron DeSantis' actual campaign apparatus, the one governed by a lot of laws that have maximum donation requirements, and therefore the campaign usually farms out its ad sales to super PACs and other organizations of the sort. They said, no, we're going to centralize it all under the super PAC. And the result was arguably one of the biggest failures of presidential primary campaign politics, in that they burned $130 million. And the result was the chief strategist getting booted from the GOP, basically, by Trump calling him out. And then headlines in the New York Times, Washington Post about how stupid of an idea this is. What can we learn from that failure when we're trying to build a centralized organization that can influence stuff from the top down?
Yeah, I would tell you, first off, you would not want to judge it off of presidential primary. It would want to be judged off of a general election, any kind of primary, really, okay? And because here's what we're having, like in social science and statistics, which I used to teach, we talk about how when temperatures got hot, right, polio rates would go up. And people were like, oh, so heat causes polio. No, okay? It's because people are going into pools when it's hot, and that's where they're getting polio, right? So in your example, I'm going to argue we have that going on, okay? Ron DeSantis' campaign failed for one reason and only one reason, right? There's no appetite for a Trump replacement when you can have Trump. Bottom line. And that's why Nikki Haley will also ultimately fail, even though she's staying in, I think, largely to be available in case Trump becomes unavailable because he's sitting in a jail cell or whatever, right? So when you look at DeSantis's campaign, I hate Ron DeSantis. I think he's a fucking horrible person. He's the stuff that he's done against gay people, I just find so offensive as a person that cares about others, right? And so it would be easy for me to shit on him. I mean, people do that with Clinton. Oh, she was a terrible candidate. just because somebody failed in a race, A, doesn't make them bad. B, it's contextual, right? So you take Bernie Sanders and that movement out of 2016 and Hillary Clinton sitting in the White House, no problem, right? So with Ron DeSantis, I still think that he could have, if Trump hadn't been in there, we'd be talking about how this beautiful centralized super PAC spending thing was brilliant and it worked so good because he's the nominee. At the end of the day, you're not getting MAGA, the cult of MAGA, to break from Trump as long as Trump is on the plate to be offered to them. And I think that explains the failure of traction for everybody, but particularly for Ron DeSantis.
Rachel, this just brings to mind kind of, I think, the last question. And I think you've kind of raised it or hinted at it in your response there, which is we do tend to take this zero-sum approach to evaluating campaigns. Every campaign that wins was perfect, and every campaign that loses was the worst campaign. It did everything wrong.
Yes.
And we can't really learn about campaigns if we only look at things that way. So, we're talking about DeSantis and whether his strategy might have had merit if they had had better luck or done a few other things differently. Can we think of some more examples of losing campaigns that were smart and effective and winning campaigns that were very bad?
Boy, that's a challenge right off the buff. I mean, I think Beto's first campaign in Texas against Ted Cruz was a losing campaign that almost did the fucking impossible, and everyone calls him a loser for it. And then, of course, he doubles down and becomes a loser by running for shit he can't win, right? Which is what I would have said. Don't run in 2022. You're not going to fucking win. There's a midterm effect, right? But in any case, that first campaign and Stacey Abrams in Georgia, those are examples of really good campaigns that have an L and don't get credit for it.
And then some winning campaigns that were bad, maybe like J.D. Vance or something like that? Or
I mean, there was no campaign. Any competent, if I was running the strategy for Tim Ryan, because Tim Ryan and I murder this strategy, and keep in mind, the candidates don't come up with this shit, it's the consultants, right? Right? So I murder Tim Ryan's strategy because it's conventional bucket strategy, a base, a persuadable middle, persuade the middle by being bipartisan and folksy. And I'm not one of those Democrats, which of course reaffirms the GOP's argument about Democrats, that there's something wrong with all of them. So when you say, oh, I'm not one of those, you're basically agreeing with Republicans and decreasing that brand. So when you think about, Tim Ryan, the media, the Beltway loved his campaign. They thought it was the best shit since sliced bread. It was absolutely no different than any Democratic swing race campaign of the last decade. And I knew it was doomed from day one because of that approach. So J.D. Vance, Rick Scott in Florida, J.D. Vance, Ron DeSantis, these are people that if you come and run a negative partisanship strategy wedge campaign where you are napalming their brand to push independent voters to you and away from them, they're all vulnerable. I mean, my God, Rick Scott is the architect of a plan that not only defunds and steals Social Security and Medicare from everybody, but has a middle-class tax hike of $5,000. We're not beating these people because we're not taking that kind of messaging approach to these races. And that's what we really need to do, because J.D. Vance should not be sitting in the Senate right now.
Well, at least J.D. Vance is, and I do not like him, at least he's charismatic. So we worked with Governor Scott at the time when I was back at Puerto Rico as an appointed official. And I think the worst thing about Rick Scott is that he is a wet paper bat. He is legitimately the American political embodiment of Voldemort and how he is portrayed in the Harry Potter movies.
Yes.
He's that slimy, super pale looking guy who has a weak voice. And he is just not, a good candidate. He's not a people person. You got to be a people person to be a good candidate. So I just wanted to shit on Rick Scott there. But I really just want.
It's always fun to shit on Rick Scott. I mean, I try to shit on Rick Scott as often as I can.
Largest Medicare fraud in U.S. history, I think, right?
No shit, dude. And you know what the thing is that the villages, they don't fucking know any of that. Most of those people in there have no idea that Rick Scott is an architect of a plan to defund and steal their Social Security. And they're not gonna know unless Rachel Bitecofer gets her ass into Florida's strategy and makes sure that that's the central theme of this upcoming Senate race.
I guess the last example maybe then of a winning campaign that was bad are these front porch campaigns from the 19th century. James Garfield. They didn't campaign and they won, Rachel, that's the opposite of what you're telling the Democrats to do, right?
No, yeah, the old party systems.
You can't do that anymore.
Yeah, that stuff's all different. And, the other thing that I try to get people to understand, and this is like the nexus of my 10 years, 13 years as a researcher and person, political scientist, is that this electorate ain't your granddaddy's electorate. It's very distinct from what existed in even the 2000s and definitely in the 90s and 80s, when the electorate was in the process of a massive geographic realignment, with the South going from completely dominated by the Democratic Party to completely dominated by the Republican Party, but white conservative voters are the same, right? They've switched parties. And, people think like what would work in the 90s. If you think what will work in the 90s, which is that old bucket strategy of a persuasion message on moderation and bipartisanship and candidate quality versus some red meat stuff for the base, like that stuff did work for Clinton in the 90s. That strategy was perfect for the 90s because there were liberal Republicans still, and there were conservative Democrats still. And those people were not reliable. They would cross over. That's where most of that crossover vote would happen. So when that was like a 20-year process for the South to de-align and realign. And, we have a very distinct electorate. It's very different. We've never had an electorate since survey data existed anyway, that looks like it does now in its tribalism and hyperpartisanship. And that's why, when you look at Republican opinion about Trump, no matter what he does, it never changes. It's the pandemic and he's telling you to drink bleach. You look at all the other world leaders. He was putting out this graph during the pandemic because it polled 6 countries. And everywhere else, you see the reaction of public opinion to the pandemic and that leader's handling of the pandemic, especially with Abe and Macron in France. There was only one country flatlined across the entire graph, and it was us, guys. We couldn't even move a public opinion as 3,000 Americans were dropping dead from COVID every day under that man's crazy leadership, right? So we are unhealthy electorate. We must fix that. But the first thing we have to fix is beating Republicans at the ballot box. And unfortunately, that means when they go low, we have to hit them where it hurts.
And Hit 'em Where It Hurts is the title of the book, How to Save Democracy by Beating Republicans at Their Own Game, by Rachel Bitecofer with Aaron Murphy. So folks, again, go check out the link on our show notes and please purchase the book and let us know what you think. But Rachel, just want to thank you very much for a pleasurable, enlightening hour-long conversation.
It was a great conversation. And I always like when ex-Republicans like Michael Steele read the book and they're like, yep, you got us, So it's nice to hear that.